we're a minute or two after 7, so I guess we should probably get started. I'd like to start out by welcoming everyone. My name is Steve Kennedy. I'm a member of the Florida Postal History Society. Thanks to Vern, he gets me to be a member of a lot of different things, so he keeps me very involved. He's a great mentor. So I would like to introduce Vern as the president of the Florida Postal History Society to say a few words.
Yeah. Well, good evening. I'm glad everybody can join the Florida Postal History Society in this Seminole Wars presentation. A lot of us have collected stamp list Florida early and probably don't fully appreciate the impact of the Seminole Wars on the mail system. But Steve Kennedy has taken the initiative to start the first Florida Postal History Zoom, and he has something really special ahead here. So I'm just going to turn this over to Steve.
Okay, so thanks. I would like to welcome everybody for the Florida Postal History Society's first Zoom presentation tonight. Tonight we're going to have John and Mary Lou Missall, and they're going to cover all 3 Seminole Wars, which is great for us. Really have in-depth information. They are members of the Florida Historical Society. It's a great place to buy their books, and also the Seminole Wars Foundation website, place to buy their. They're very prolific. I sent out a list with some of their books on there. It's just incredible the amount that they have had and the depth of knowledge about this particular subject. So we really appreciate them being here tonight. And with that, I'll and one thing, make sure you check their website too, www.missall.net. I want to make sure I say that at the beginning and at the end. Please check out their website. And I'd like to introduce John and Mary Lou. And thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you for having us.
We appreciate it.
Okay, and I guess everybody can see the slide presentation.
Yes.
Okay. All righty. Well, just kind of for those of you who aren't familiar with the Seminole Wars, which is damn near everybody in the country, there were 3 Seminole Wars, covered a period of more than 40 years from 1812 up to 1858. During that period, there were 3 periods of open warfare. What we call the First War was from 1817, 1818, and it was an invasion into Spanish Florida to subdue the Indians, capture runaway slaves, and while we're at it, steal Florida from Spain. The Second War was fought in the territory of Florida from 1835 to 1842, and was an effort to remove the Seminole to new homes in what is now Oklahoma. And then finally, what we call the Third Seminole War was 1855 to 1858, and it was an effort to remove the last few hundred Seminole from Florida.
But it's important to keep in mind, the Seminole don't see it as 3 separate wars. As far as they're concerned, it was a nearly 50-year struggle for survival against unrelenting pressure. Sometimes the pressure was diplomatic, and other times it was military, but it never ceased.
Now, these were no small set of wars, and these are some statistics just from the Second Seminole War. First, it lasted 7 years. Indian Wars at the time rarely lasted more than a year. It cost, for that 7-year period, cost $30 million at a time when the entire federal budget for 1836 was only $25 million. At one point, half the regular army was in Florida, along with thousands of volunteers from as far away as Missouri. This was a national conflict. And it was all against the Seminole tribe of only maybe 5,000 people, of which maybe 1,500 were warriors. The top 4 generals in the army commanded the war at different times, and they all left embarrassed. It was the biggest news story of 1836 and 1837. Now, we discovered this by looking at the indexes for national newspapers at the time. And there were more articles on the Seminole War than there was for the War of Texas Independence. You remember the Alamo, and the presidential election of 1836 combined. It's the only Indian War where the Navy played an important role, and the only Indian War that was closely tied to the subject of slavery. The Seminole Wars affected the entire state, from Pensacola to the Keys. And what we're going to do tonight is take you on a little tour of Florida, showing you places that are associated with the wars, most of which you can actually visit.
And we'll also be bringing you some of the voices from the wars by way of quotations from people who were involved in them.
Okay, first place we're going to go is called Fort Gadsden. And in July of 1816, the United States forces entered Spanish Florida to destroy an abandoned British fort from the War of 1812 that had been occupied by Indians and runaway slaves. The fort was destroyed in one massive explosion when a hot cannonball from a Navy gunboat struck the fort's powder magazine, killing nearly all of the occupants. Army Staff Surgeon Marcus Buck wrote to his father, telling him,
Hundreds of lifeless bodies were stretched upon the plain, buried in the sand and rubbish, or suspended from the tops of the surrounding pines. Here lay an innocent babe, there a helpless mother. On the other side, a sturdy warrior. On the other, a bleeding squaw.
and the site has been preserved as a park in the Apalachicola National Forest. There we go. Okay, on November 30th, 1817, the First Seminole War began with an Indian attack on an Army transport boat ascending the Apalachicola River. A day earlier, the boat's commander, Lieutenant Richard W. Scott, had written to his superior officer, telling him,
Mr. Hamley informs me that Indians are assembling at the junction of the river where they intend to make a stand against those vessels coming up the river. And should this be the case, I'm not able to make a stand against them. My entire command does not exceed 40 men, and half of them are sick and without arms.
by the end of the next day, Scott, nearly all his 40 men, along with 6 women and 4 children, were dead. The site's now a county park and boat ramp in the town of Chattahoochee. And there's actually a reenactment of the event held there, usually the first week in December. So why does this seem to... Okay. Anyway, in March of 1818, General Andrew Jackson invaded Florida to punish the Seminole. After taking the small Spanish post at St. Mark's, he executed a pair of British subjects that had been captured. As he told the Secretary of War,
these individuals were tried under my orders by a special court of select officers, legally convicted as exciters of this savage and Negro war, legally condemned, and most justly punished for their iniquities.
He kept saying legally because it wasn't really legal. This was Andrew Jackson, and he did what he wanted to. The remains of the fort are now a state park. Jackson then turned his attention to Pensacola, which was the capital of Spanish West Florida at the time. Before heading to Florida, Jackson had told President Monroe,
if the possession of the Floridas would be desirable to the United States, in 60 days, it will be accomplished.
Monroe never responded, and Jackson's orders specifically said not to molest the Spaniards, who we were at peace with. Fort Barrancas, where the Spaniards mounted an unsuccessful defense, has been preserved at the Pensacola Naval Air Station. And I don't know if any of you have ever gone to the Pensacola station. They have a wonderful air and space museum there. And this fort is right across the street. Soon after Jackson's conquest of Florida, Spain ceded the colony to the United States. One of the biggest points of contention between the incoming Americans and the Seminole was cattle. Payne's Prairie State Park is on the site where many Seminole villages were located and where they kept thousands of heads of cattle. As one frustrated chief complained,
The white people have carried all the red man's people's cattle off. I sent to all my people to let the white people alone and stay on this side of the river, and they did so. But the white people still continue to carry off their cattle.
in 1823, the Seminole were pressured into signing the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, which forced them onto a reservation in central Florida, and you can see the outline of it on that map. The Seminole were not dealing from a position of strength. One of their chiefs explained,
We are poor and needy. We do not come here to murmur or complain. We rely upon your justice and humanity.
and the site of the negotiations is now a county park outside Fort Lauderdale, or outside St. Augustine. To help keep the settlers and the Indians separated, Fort King was constructed near Silver Springs, which eventually grew into the city of Ocala. Tensions between the two groups continued to rise, and in 1832, the Seminole were forced to sign a new treaty, giving up all rights to their homes in Florida in exchange for new land in what's now Oklahoma. Most of the Seminole were in no mood to leave Florida. When the Indian agent refused to sell him gunpowder, something that was only denied slaves, Osceola warned him,
The white man shall not make me black. I will make the white man red with blood and then blacken him in the sun and rain, and the buzzard shall live upon his flesh.
the fort has recently been reconstructed and a reenactment is held there first weekend in December, I believe. Refusing to give up their homeland, the Seminole took up arms in December 1835. They attacked a column of soldiers midway between Tampa Bay and Fort King, which was Ocala, in what became known as the Dade Massacre. Only 3 of the 108 soldiers survived. One of them described the scene.
We had scarcely arranged our defenses when the Indians again appeared and completely surrounded us. Notwithstanding the desperate resistance of the troops, the enemy gained the stockade, climbed over the breastwork, and commenced an indiscriminate slaughter of everyone within the enclosure.
The site of the battle is now a state park, and again, we hold a reenactment there. It's the biggest one of the year. Each year on the first weekend of January. This year it'll be January 1st and 2nd. The Seminole also practiced economic warfare by attacking every sugar plantation in this territory, completely destroying Florida's largest industry and freeing hundreds of slaves. All the sites shown on the map here have some sort of ruins that can be visited. The Army suffered yet another defeat on New Year's Eve, 1835, when the Seminole repulsed a force of 750 soldiers at the Withlacoochee River. Then in February 1836, General Edmund Gaines came from New Orleans with more than 1,000 men. When he too tried to cross the Withlacoochee, the Seminoles stopped him and held him under siege at Camp Izard for over a week. Lieutenant Henry Prince commented on one of the Seminole attacks.
I ran to my company amidst a storm of bullets. It seems to me impossible for bullets to fly thicker anywhere than they did round me. They would cut holes through the palmetto leaves 3 feet from us, while other bullets would fall dead all round me.
And the site of Camp Izzard has been preserved on land owned by the Southwest Florida Water Management District. Things only got worse for the Army. In April of 1836, the Seminole managed to elude an army of 5,000 men, led by Winfield Scott, the Army's top field officer. And it wasn't just a regular army that was suffering at the hands of the Seminole. In November 1836, Florida Governor Richard Keith Call led an army of mostly volunteers against the Seminole. Part of that force was made up of Creek Indians fighting against the Seminole. Major David Moniac, the first Native American to graduate West Point, was killed in the Battle of Wahoo Swamp. A headstone in his honor has been erected at the National Cemetery in Bushnell. The year 1837 marks the beginning of the exploration of the interior of Florida. As one officer quipped,
A runaway slave could draw a map in the sand that would be better than anything Washington could send us.
Florida had only been explored basically the coastline. The interior was almost totally unknown. In realizing the Seminole could only be defeated by a long war of attrition, the Army began to build forts all over the peninsula, usually a day's march apart and well stocked with food and ammunition. Two of those forts have been reconstructed. Fort Foster is at the Hillsborough River State Park, north of Tampa, and Fort Christmas is at the town of Christmas, east of Orlando. Events are held at both forts during the winter season.
Except for this year, we're not sure.
Yeah, COVID permitting. As the Army and Navy moved through Florida, they came across bodies of waters that no white man had ever seen. Many lakes in Florida are named for the officers who discovered them or other military heroes. One officer said,
We know more about the interior of China than we do of Florida.
all this effort by the government was bound to have an effect, and many Seminole began to surrender or were captured. The most famous prisoners, including Osceola, were housed at the Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine, then known as Fort Marion. In November of 1837, about 20 Indians made an escape through a narrow window in one of the walls, the one we have showing on the picture there. On Christmas Day, 1837, Colonel Zachary Taylor fought the fiercest battle of the war along the north shore of Lake Okeechobee. One unit, the 6th Infantry, lost nearly every officer. As Colonel William S. Foster of the 4th Infantry noted,
They endeavored to enter the swamp, but in doing so suffered a severe loss. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, Captain Van Swearingen, Lieutenant Brooke, and Adjutant Center were killed previous to their entering the swamp. The Sergeant Major was mortally wounded and died 30 hours later.
although the battle was basically a draw and the Army suffered horrendous casualties, Taylor gained national fame, which started him on the path to the White House. The site of the battle has recently been acquired as a state park, and we hold a reenactment there every year in late February. A place called Harney's Point is a spot where the bridge from the crossing the Caloosahatchee River comes into downtown Cape Coral. By the spring of 1839, Congress had tired of the war and negotiated a peace with the Seminole. This is about the only time in our nation's history when an Indian nation has forced the government to sue for peace. As part of the agreement, Colonel William S. Harney erected a trading post on the Caloosahatchee River. Before it could be completed, the Indians attacked, killing about 20 men. Harney himself had to escape into the river in his underwear. The war eventually moved into the southern portion of the peninsula. Indians under the chief Chakika even attacked the isolated settlement on Indian Key, killing the noted botanist Dr. Henry Perrine, who now has a city named after him in South Florida. Conditions in the rainy season were brutal. One officer reported,
We were marching through water from 6 inches to 3 feet deep, 48 days. No more than 200 men of the 800 could be mustered for duty. Fevers, diarrheas, and swollen feet and ankles having laid up in the hospital 3/4 of the command.
and it was a little better in winter. An Army surgeon said,
We suffered very much during this march from the scarcity of water, every part of the ground being parched by the excessively hot sun. Our only mode of procuring it on many occasions was to dig holes in the ground, it being generally found at a depth of 1 to 2 feet from the surface, but of the color and consistency of ink. And we had to drink that or go without.
in 1842, after spending 7 exhausting years, millions of dollars, and thousands of lives, the government decided to let the few hundred surviving Seminole live in Southwest Florida. The remains of hundreds of dead soldiers from all over the peninsula were brought to the St. Francis Barracks Military Cemetery in St. Augustine and reinterred beneath 3 stone pyramids. This is kind of like the Seminole War Memorial. The shooting war might have ended, but pressure continued to be placed upon those remaining Seminole to emigrate to the West. In 1849, outlaw Indians attacked a settlement at Fort Pierce and a trading post at Payne's Creek, killing several whites. One of the survivors, William McCullough, later testified,
We had scarcely got seated at the supper table when they fired in at the door from the outside. One Indian standing on either side of the door, 2 in the front, 1 behind the other. By this shot, Captain Payne and Dempsey Whidden were killed dead, and I received a bullet in my left shoulder.
and even though the Seminole turned in the killers, the pressure only increased. And the site of the attack on Payne's Creek is now a state park on the Peace River, and it's we hold a reenactment of the attack every spring. The Army in 1850 opened Fort Myers, which is our home, so that they could exert more pressure on the Indians. In 1855, the Seminole, led by Chief Billy Bowlegs, responded to that pressure by attacking an Army survey party in Big Cypress, thus commencing the Third Seminole War. In June 1856, there was a small battle near Fort Meade, and it wasn't the Army doing the fighting, it was a local militia. Both the Indians and whites, desperate to defend their homes, knew they were in a fight to the death. One militia officer gave details of the battle.
One Indian charged on William McCullough as in a fisticuff fight. They striking and fending off with their empty guns, had it round and round till McCullough threw down his gun, clenched the Indian, threw him down and caught and held his wrist until Daniel Carleton ran to his assistance and cut the Indian's throat, leaving him for dead.
Now, this is the same William McCullough that had barely escaped the attack on the trading post in 1849. For men on both sides, this was a very personal war. The Seminole held on for over 2 years, but the military pressure was unrelenting. In boats and on foot, the Army searched the Big Cypress and the Everglades, destroying any villages or farms they discovered. As one officer reported,
There were about 30 lodges and about 40 acres of lands cleared and in cultivation. Large quantities of pumpkin, potatoes, peas, corn, and rice were found. The pumpkins were in the fields, and the ground was literally covered with them of all ages and sizes. The ground was full of potatoes. Everything was destroyed that could be.
as people starving and without home, Bowlegs was forced to give up the fight. After surrendering at Fort Myers, he and his people were taken to a prison camp on what is now Egmont Key State Park outside Tampa Bay, then shipped to Oklahoma. Yet there are still Seminole in Florida. Less than 200 survived the war and remain in their cherished homeland. These are the people who would not give up. At first, they kept to themselves, avoiding nearly all contact with whites. When highways and the draining of the Everglades made that impossible, they entered into the tourist trade. In the 1950s, when the government wanted to disband the tribes, they formed their own government and declared their sovereignty. Faced with poverty, they established Indian gaming, the first in the nation. Today, they're a proud and prosperous symbol of Florida and remain an unconquered people. And there's the ad at the end of the program, all our books. I did do some research in the books I think you'll find interesting about postal carriers and mail service during the time. Steve Kennedy did an excellent article in your newsletter where he mentioned the disruption of mail between Jacksonville and St. Augustine due to Indian attacks. And I'd like to provide a little bit more detail about that particular incident. On February 13th, 1840, the mail stage from St. Augustine to Jacksonville was ambushed, and the driver, a youth of 16 or 17, was killed. While searching for the boy's murderers, soldiers discovered the body of another mail carrier. The St. Augustine newspaper reported,
Garcias was a native of this city and a young man about 22 years of age, of exemplary character and integrity. He was married about 4 months since, and when his mangled corpse was brought home, the feelings of his young wife may possibly be felt, but never described.
during the Second Seminole War, mail had been a haphazard affair, especially at the more remote forts. If you dropped a letter in the mail, you could never be sure who was going to carry it and how much it would cost. That unpredictability meant that the recipient paid the postage, and no one could be sure when a letter would arrive. By the 1850s, all that had changed. The post office now issued stamps and carried letters for a set amount, just as they do today. This meant that Major Thomas Williams, stationed at Fort Deneau on the Caloosahatchee River during the Third Seminole War, could know approximately how long it would take a letter to reach his wife Maggie in Detroit, what route it would take, and even who would deliver it.
The steamboat Ranger will take it down the river to Fort Myers tomorrow. Thence it will be dispatched about Sunday next to Tampa Bay. Thence by stagecoach to Palatka, Florida. Thence by steamer to Charleston, South Carolina. And thence by sea steamer to New York. And thence by rail to Windsor, opposite Detroit. And thence by ferry boat to Detroit to the post office. And thence by the hands of Devereaux to Maggie. All these journeys will take from 10 to 15 days.
Early in the Third Seminole War, the Indians had carried out several attacks in the area of Tampa Bay which made everyone in Central Florida nervous, including the mail carriers. Inspector General Churchill, who'd been in the vicinity of one of the attacks, informed the Army's Adjutant General that the mail between Palatka and Tampa was being held at the post office.
The contractor not being willing to venture through without a guard, so long as it may be supposed the Indians who attacked Captain Bradley's house are in the vicinity. Perhaps the mail might go through in safety, but I do not think it would be prudent to risk it.
Wanting protection, the mail contractor wrote to Senator Yulee in Washington, who took his concerns to the Postmaster General, who in turn passed them on to Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who then referred the whole matter back to Florida and offered little encouragement for any real assistance. Everyone from postal carriers to surveyors to the isolated homesteader wanted protection, but there simply weren't enough soldiers to go around or the funds to pay for them. The officer in charge of Tampa finally authorized an escort of Florida militia volunteers, but they proved less than adequate. The volunteers were late in arriving at the starting point and then decided they had to stop and rest after only 13 miles of the 75-mile trip. Took some time, but the driver convinced them to continue, insisting that the mail and the passengers were on a schedule. The escort relented, but only went 6 additional miles before stopping again to rest. Exasperated, the driver went on without him. Now, if any of you have ever been in the military, stationed far from home, the following quote will sound familiar. An officer at Fort Dallas, which would become Miami, told how the men anxiously awaited the arrival of the mail.
We can reasonably expect the regular arrival of the mail, but as the precise days are not fixed, we make the most of this circumstance in a conjectural way, with frequent visits to the wharf, straining our eyes in the direction of the entrance of the harbor several days before we know the mail ought to arrive. We then wonder what was detained it, what news it will bring, etc., etc. Each one in turn usually goes through the stereotype formula of wondering, while the rest chime in various surmises of this, that, or the other, all entering into the discussion with as much zeal as if the subject was being broached for the first instant of the 99th time. Let me go back again. They were all entering into the discussion with as much zeal as if the subject was being broached for the first instead of the 99th time. When a strange sail really does appear in sight, the excitement becomes intense. The whole garrison flocks out to such points as command a view of the approaching vessel and await its coming. As eagerly as might, so many shipwrecked sailors cast away on the shores of some desert island.
Okay, so we can open it up for question and answers. Anybody has a question or two?
So that sounds great. I have everybody muted, so if you would like to ask a question, please unmute yourself. And I would like to start off with one just because I'm the only one unmuted. How did they feed those guys? Like you talked about, the forts were pretty well stocked with food and there were cattle involved. But as they got further and further south, how did you just supply the amount of people that were involved?
The Army was great on logistics. And at the height of the war, the officer who was actually in charge was the Army's quartermaster general, who was the person in charge of moving things around and getting stuff places. But they used thousands of horses. Fort Foster, north of Tampa, was mainly a supply depot. And every few days, a wagon train would come through, hundreds of horses, pulling wagons. That's one of the reasons this was such an expensive war, because literally government was throwing everything they had at the Seminole. And one of the reasons it lasted 7 years, because a lot of people were making money off this war. And, they did everything they could to keep it going. And I mentioned everything that came to Florida had to come from someplace else, because Florida had very small population, no industry whatsoever. So every item of war material had to come from arsenals all over the country. It was a major undertaking.
Thanks.
Next question.
Well, I think Florida had a lot of cattle and beef supplies.
It did. And like I mentioned earlier, that was one of the big contentions. But once the war got started, there wasn't enough cattle. Most of the time they ate standard Army issue rations, hard bread, dried meat, beans. Believe me, I've eaten it. It's not very appetizing at all, but it was stuff that could be shipped. And unfortunately, cattle was never where you wanted it to be. But after the wars, cattle became Florida's big industry. And today, the Seminole tribe of Florida is like one of the nation's top 10 cattle producers.
What was the incentive for the United States government to be fighting the Seminoles? It sounds like there wasn't any Americans in Florida at that point, or very few. What was the incentive of even doing it?
It had everything had to do with the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which basically said any Indians living east of the Mississippi would be sent west of the Mississippi. I know a lot of you heard of the Cherokee Trail of Tears. That was all part of the same thing. The Cherokee, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek Indians, all were Southern tribes. They were all, one way or another, sent out west. The Seminole, because Florida was empty and they knew the place, they were able to hold on for so long. It had, again, slavery was tied into this. Plantation owners envisioned all sorts of plantations in Florida, and they were just ready to go. A lot of just ordinary homesteaders wanted to come to Florida. So yes, there weren't many whites here, but there were a lot who wanted to come, until the reports started coming back of how really horrible the place was. And all of a sudden people wanted to go west.
How about today? Has the Seminole survived?
Quite well. There's about maybe 3,500 Seminole in Florida today, all descendants of those about 200 who managed to survive the war. They are probably one of the wealthiest tribes in the country. They started Indian gaming. They have casinos all over Florida. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the Hard Rock casinos, cafes, hotels. They own that. They have one chief, Chief James Billy. He had this idea. He was a Vietnam War vet. He came home. The tribe was in poverty. And he said, we can do something with gaming. And he built the tribe up. And there's a slightly, I'd say, different attitude with Florida Seminoles than you find with other tribes. These people are proud. They're unconquered. They'll tell you that right off. Other tribes, you know, they've all wound up where they're at because they were forced there. The Seminole, they hung on.
Did any of the people who were sent to Oklahoma ever make it back?
No, there are probably a few that came back. The most famous one is a woman named Polly Parker. She was actually on the boat at the end of the Third War going out to Oklahoma. The steamboat stopped at Pensacola or St. Mark's to get wood for the steam engine. And she somehow escaped and walked all the way back from the Panhandle back to around Lake Okeechobee. And she was an old woman at the time. I mean, these people were determined. But once they got out to Oklahoma, there just really wasn't any way for them to get back. And today, it's two separate tribes. You've got the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma, and you've got the Seminole tribe of Florida down here.
And
the
what,
local, in the local area TV here from Orlando, there's been some commercials where they've had some Seminole Indians. I don't know if it's the chief or whatever, the Florida tribes, but they have signed a compact with Florida, and they've been pushing that for the establishment of jobs and such as that for the casinos. And they show a couple of Hard Rocks in the piece.
They are a political force in Florida.
what about the Seminole Nation itself, which would be in Oklahoma?
They're not doing so well. Part of the problem was the fact that when they were sent out there, they were amalgamated. They had a separate parcel of land, but they were under the Creek Indians. And the Creek were their mortal enemies. And then also, when they opened up Oklahoma for settlement, they passed the law that basically took this tribal land and exchanged it for personal parcels. In other words, before it was a tribal territory. Now each family was given their own little tract of land. And that really tended to, damage the tribe. Somebody's got a cat at her.
We didn't put the cat to sleep.
One question people ask, which I'm surprised nobody has yet, it's usually the first one, is where did the Seminole come from? Because when the Spaniards arrived here, there were hundreds of thousands of Indians in Florida, but there were no Seminole. A couple of hundred years of Spanish rule wiped out nearly all the indigenous Indians in Florida. By early 1700s, there were hardly any left. And people from north of the Florida border, from what's now Georgia and Alabama, Creek Indians basically, started to migrate into Florida to, it was good hunting ground. Indians at the time, their main business was hunting for deer skins. That was a big trade with Europe, was deer skins. And in Georgia and Alabama, they pretty much decimated the herds of deer. So they came into Florida, set up permanent settlements, and eventually became politically separate. And this took about 100 years. You had two different linguistic groups coming down. Even today, the Seminole tribe of Florida, there are different reservations that speak different languages. They were not one solidified tribe, except during the wartime. They came together. But there are definitely different groupings within the tribe.
On a separate note, on your series of books, it looked like there were 6 or 8 of them that was on the pages you showed. Are they different subjects of this war, or are they?
Yeah, let me put that back up there. All right. The last one, of course. Okay, we've done 3 histories. Let me go to. Okay, there we go. Okay, we've done 3 histories. Our first book was The Seminole Wars from the University Press. That went through 2 hardcover printings, then paperback, and ran for about 15 years. And it's just gone out of print because we replaced it with The Seminole Struggle. And it's just been updated. We also did with our good friend Joe Knetsch a history of the Third Seminole War, which is really the only detailed history of that conflict.
The poetry was an interesting one. When I would do the research on microfilm, occasionally I would come across poems that people wrote at the time. And I thought, well, that's interesting. But that's the way people wrote at the time. So I just started making copies of all these poems that people wrote that had to do with either about people or about the war in general. And that's that collection.
We've done biographies of Colonel William S. Foster, who was a senior officer in the war. He was always like second in command, but he kept his papers, and the family kept them and allowed us to use them to write Colonel Foster's biography. And then another one we found, if anybody was an Army officer, you might be interested in this. Major John Rogers Vinton, he was the first graduate from West Point from Rhode Island. And we managed to get his papers from the day he graduated West Point in 1817 at the ripe old age of 16 till the day he was killed 30 years later in the Mexican War. So it's a really good examination of a mid-grade Army officer's life in that whole antebellum period. We've done 3 novels, and this must be an old slide because I haven't entered the newest one. Elizabeth's War is a novel about the First Seminole War. Reason it's named Elizabeth's War, one of our first slides talked about the Scott Massacre, where the 40 soldiers have been killed on a boat, 6 women and 4 children. Well, there was one woman who survived that battle and was taken captive by the Indians. And basically, this is a fictional account of her time, of her life, including the captivity. It's on the top there someplace. The Hollow Victory is a novel of the Second Seminole War. Basically takes a group of whites and Indians, kind of balanced, and just carrying us through this whole 7-year period. You know, all the no-win situations, all the decisions had to be made. And then the latest one, which let me stop the share.
See if we can see this.
I don't know, can you all see that or not?
Yeah, pretty good.
Okay, that one we did came out last year. And we're really proud of that one because a lot of people, when we're giving talks, you know, they'll come up to the table and they'll say, yeah, you've done a history, but what's the Seminole side of the story? Because when you're doing history, you have to use things you can, you know, citations. You have to have written records that you can quote. And of course, there just isn't any from the Seminole. There's oral histories and stuff. A good friend of ours in the tribe was Willie Johns. He was tribal historian. He was the Chief Justice of the Seminole tribal court system. And for years, he'd kind of been saying, well, someday I'd like to do a story about my great-grandmother who lived through the wars. And finally, we got tired of hearing him say that and took the hint and said, okay, Willie, let's do the story. And so this book, it's called What We Have Endured. It's written from a Seminole woman's perspective, going through the whole period. Starting out, she's 12 years old. At the end of the war, she's about 60. Always in the wrong place at the wrong time. And her story, although she's a fictional character, all these things happened to the Seminole. Didn't happen to her, it happened to somebody, sometimes lots of somebodies. And we're just really proud to be able to work with Willie on that. He's our co-author, and you know, we'd write something and take it to him, and he'd say, "Oh no, that ain't right," or "You can't say that," or you know, just the cultural parts in the book are from him. And it was such an honor to work with him. The sad part was he passed away the day after the book came out.
Wow.
But at least, you know, he did get to see a copy of it. But it was just one of those things of just, you know, to get, that close to someone in the tribe, it takes time. Obviously, all Indians are a little standoffish of whites for good reason. But it was just really an honor to be able to work with them and know them that well.
So one thing I'd like to throw out a tidbit for some guys. I know one of the things we do all the time is research, right? And I learned a lot when I was working with Vern and Dr. Briggs, about the article I was writing. One of the great resources that I found was Niles' weekly register.
Yeah.
It's online and it's all free, and you can search. It's almost exactly coincides with the time frame of all three Seminole Wars.
Well,
so that's one.
Yeah.
What other tips do you have? Maybe
there's one called
research?
the Army Navy Chronicles.
That's
Breaking up.
Army and Navy Chronicles. And that's now online too. And that was written for the servicemen. And at that time, a lot of the people who were serving, they wrote to that magazine or paper giving their experiences. And so that's a wealth of stuff. A little bit more deeper to get into is the American state papers are online. That's official documents and stuff. A lot of what the research we did for our books was reading through these letters and, seeing what these people were saying at the time. You mentioned Niles' Register. Earlier in the talk, I mentioned that this was the biggest news story of 1836 and 1837. Right. Well, it's their index that we use to compile that data.
Right. I'm going to grab one book too here real quickly.
John, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah. A lot of what you've said is on the side of the Seminoles. There were obviously some atrocities that took place. And do you work at all with Cantor Brown, the author?
Oh yeah. Well, I know him. We don't work with him, but
well, I'm working on Fort Meade right now.
Okay.
And there was a terrible massacre there, the Whiddens, and finally we got General Twigg out of Tampa, worked where he actually made the Seminoles turn in the two Seminoles that had killed them, and they were then obviously executed.
No, they weren't.
A trade-off so that they could be safely go down to the Okeechobee area and the new area in South Florida, which they were giving the Seminoles a chance to stay in Florida. You haven't said anything about how the Seminoles could stay in Florida instead of being all forced to go to Oklahoma. Could you explain that?
Okay. The incident you're talking about, we did mention at Paynes Creek State Park. Okay. And actually, interesting thing about that, Bowlegs did turn in there were 4 Indians in the attack. One of them was killed.
I think they turned in about 3 of them. Yeah.
They turned in 2 of them.
2 of them.
But the funny part about that is no court wanted to handle the case. So they were kept at Fort Choclanicola and finally given $100 and sent west.
No, they were executed by Twigg.
What happened? Now, there was another incident about a year later when an orphan named Daniel Hubbard was killed. The Seminole turned in those killers, and those were executed.
Well, there was a trade-off to give the Seminoles a chance to have a free space in South Florida down near Fort Myers.
Right.
And I have a letter which outlined the entire area that they were going to be given. And I don't understand why we don't talk about some of the trade-offs that the military was going to give the Seminoles a chance to have their own area in Florida, not being sent to Oklahoma.
Okay, now what you got to realize in this, we had just gone through 7 years of really brutal
This was in the
warfare.
third Seminole War.
Right.
Yeah.
But at the end of the Second War, everybody was tired of the war. And so the Seminole were given this reservation in Southwest Florida at the end of the Second War. And this attack in 1849 was going to upset that, because the agreement had been, you can stay there in Southwest Florida as long as you're peaceable. And this attack in 1849, of course, now we're not peaceable anymore. And so that's Bowlegs, and they turned those people in as a peace offering, saying, listen, these were outlaws. We had nothing to do with this. We're not being belligerent. We want to stay here where you said we could stay as long as we remain peaceful. But the outcome of that attack in 49 was the settlers became nervous and started demanding of the government that we get the Seminole out of there. And that's the pressure just kept on coming. And when Jefferson Davis became Secretary of War in 1852, I think so, under Buchanan, he really wanted the Seminole out, and he really increased the pressure until in 1855, the Seminole reacted, and then we have the Third War beginning. The only reason
I like
the
to,
Seminole, yeah,
I like to take Dean's point earlier. After the First Seminole War, we started pushing the Seminoles south of the northern part of Florida. Around early 1820s, weren't they compensated every year per person because they had to relocate down to the Great Prairie?
right. In the Treaty of Moultrie Creek in 1823, they were given this 4 million acre reservation in Central Florida. One thing people don't realize is at the beginning of all this, the Seminole lived in North Florida, up around the Panhandle, only down south about as far as, say, Ocala. The war.
Mikanopi, Wantons. They had a trading post at Wantons, which is now Mikanopi,
Right,
which is where they had a trading post.
right. And that's about as far south as they went.
1827. Yeah.
Right. So the whole thing of these wars, these almost 50 years, keeps driving them further and further south. So that, I mean, they're in the Everglades because that was the last place they could survive, where they could hide out from the army. They're not there by choice.
It seems like a lot of the problems that could have been alleviated was these aberrant Seminoles who attacked settlers who were trying to establish further north than their territory. Obviously around Fort Meade, in Wauchula areas up in mid-central Florida. And once they were given all the lands down south of Fort Myers, which was good lands, it was not the swamps of the
Everglades.
that you describe. I think that Billy Bowlegs probably tried to pacify things, but there were a few renegades that obviously needed to be captured and actually executed.
Well, and there were.
Yeah.
Again, that in 1849 and
A lot of what you said though is how horrible the military was to the Seminoles. I don't think that's totally accurate, in that the Seminoles tried to be peaceful. Certainly the settlers, we had all these lands that were being given to settlers to come down to Central Florida. They were giving them for like 25 cents an acre to come down and settle. And yes, you had all the forts to try to protect them, but I think there was a trade-off between the Seminoles, a few of the Seminoles who were hostile, and the vast majority who tried to be all peaceful and try to settle this whole country. There weren't even 20,000 people in all of Florida in South the time. I mean, by the time the Civil War came, there were only 50,000 people in all of Florida. Half of them were slaves. So
Yeah, it was very sparsely
anyway.
populated.
Yeah, I think probably the underlying problem was misunderstandings of civilizations. And I think the white people view the Indians as part of the wilderness, that they didn't own anything.
Well, and you mentioned atrocities. The Seminole, when they went to war, it was total war. Women and children not accepted. We fought civilized war, except the militia and the volunteers. But there were atrocities on both sides. Believe me, plenty of it. And the problem is that's not, when the whites did it, that didn't make it into the newspapers. When an Indian did it, that was front page news. But no, sometimes we get this impression that everybody was playing by the rules. The rules a lot of times were very brutal. And like I said, the Indians, when they went to war, when they dug up that hatchet that had been buried, nobody was safe, even your friends. There was one incident in the beginning of the Third War. One of the chiefs had been very friendly with a guy around Miami. But when the war broke out, that guy was killed. They had, this attitude that, okay, we're going to war. It's been decided. And no prisoners.
I had one thing there too. I'm resonating with what you said there about the civilized war type thing. I do remember this is a book here about the Niles Weekly Register. I'm not sure that's coming up, but there's a guy, David Fowler, that wrote a 5-part book that extracted all the Florida information from the Niles Register. And I was reading through, and one of the big things there was when we got dogs from Cuba.
Oh yeah,
right. So and there were a lot of people in the country that were kind of outraged that there was maybe not civil, if you want to use the words that you were using. Well, and it was a big thing in Washington and Congress, and everybody was arguing about, the right way to
this was part of the slavery thing. What it was, people had heard, the Florida legislature had heard that bloodhounds had ended a really long slave rebellion in Jamaica. They'd been able to find out where the runaway slaves were hiding. And they said, oh, this is great. Now we can find where all the Indians are hiding in Florida. And so evidently there were no bloodhounds in America. I don't understand that. But anyway, they sent to Cuba and got some pack of these hounds with their handlers. And the anti-slavery movement said, well, these are just here to capture runaway slaves. They're not to get Indians, they're here to capture runaway slaves, because that was their agenda. And other humanitarians said, oh, those dogs are just gonna tear everybody up. All the Indian women and children are just gonna attack and mutilate the Indians. And so it became a big political football. As it turns out, the dogs were so well trained, they were only trained to hunt slaves. They didn't care about Indians. And so the whole thing turned out to be a waste of time. Plus, it's wet in Florida. You get in South Florida, and the bloodhounds just really weren't any good in wet, territory.
Do we know how many pieces of property the Seminole tribe still owns, or the reservation, if they are still called reservations, or is the hard?
They're reservations. Okay, the main one is in Hollywood, Florida, near Fort Lauderdale. That's where their headquarters are. Most of them live there, the largest amount of them. There's a small reservation, and it's a separate tribe. It's the Mikanopi tribe of Florida. They're out on what's called, not Alligator,
Yeah.
Tamiami Trail, west of Miami. near
Okay.
the Everglades. The kind of like you might say the homeland is what we call the Big Cypress, which is in the north. It's in the middle of the state, north of the Everglades. It's a large reservation. That's kind of the spiritual homeland where a lot of them live. They have an excellent museum. If you're any of you in Florida are ever out there, it's really a first-class museum. It just opened up after being shut down for over a year because of COVID. There is a reservation on the north side of Lake Okeechobee, Brighton Reservation. That's significant because that's major cattle ranches and agricultural. It's also, although it's part of the Seminole tribe of Florida, nearly all the residents are Creek Indians who came down before the war, and they're the ones who speak a different language from the rest of the Seminole. There's a small one in Tampa where the casino is, and another small one around Fort Pierce on the East Coast.
But they are still called reservations.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that word and yeah.
Yeah,
Any idea of the census of the number of Seminoles and or Creeks?
the total is around 3,500, and there's a lot of mixed breed in there, a lot of mixed blood, because they're getting assimilated.
Well, 3,500 is not a large amount of people. That's what I was curious.
Well, yeah,
Wow.
That comes from about 200 at the end of the war.
Well, yeah.
So, and they really didn't expand that much until, starting in the 50s and 60s.
Thank you.
Okay.
Also, one other thing, have you looked at the Black Seminoles? That
Good
whole,
subject.
that was kind of fascinating to me when I heard about that,
Right. You got to remember when all this starts, this is Spanish Florida. And the Spanish needed settlers. They needed people to, for their militia to protect their land from the English who were land hungry. And if you were a slave in Georgia, Carolina, Alabama area, if you could get across that line into Florida, you're free. And a lot of them did. A lot of them stayed near the Spanish settlements. And when Spain left, they went with them. But a lot of them moved in with the Seminole. The Seminole also held slaves. They bought them. But they didn't treat them like Southern plantation owners. Generally, the blacks lived in their own villages nearby. And really the only thing they had to do for their masters was supply them with like a portion of their farm produce every year. Otherwise, they could pretty much do what they wanted to. They became important in the tribe, some of them. Chief Mikanopi, who was head of the tribe at the beginning of the Second Seminole War, his chief advisor was a black named Abraham. The blacks tended to fight harder than the Indians during the war because the Indians, might lose their land. If you're a black and you get captured, you're going back to some plantation. So the blacks fought very hard. Probably at about the beginning of the Second Seminole War, maybe 15% of the Seminole population was black. And of course, one of the big points of contention between the whites and the Indians, slave owners wanted their property back. And that included descendants of somebody who might have escaped a generation ago. As far as they were concerned, most of those blacks living with the Seminole were property of somebody. And that was one of the big points of contention because as far as the Seminole were concerned, these were their people.
Interesting.
Okay, any other?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, and this might be a question for everybody, is there mail that moves between the Seminoles on their reservation? Like if
Mail?
they had, mail. I'm just thinking of it from postal history point of view. Like if you're sending mail
Oh,
amongst
it's
each other?
regular US mail.
So, but don't they have like their own police department and own?
Oh,
different
they have their
things?
own police department,
But still are.
school system, all that. But mail is, if I send a letter to a friend of ours on the reservation in the Big Cypress, it's a Clewiston address, which is a town, 20, 30 miles away. So it gets delivered from the Clewiston post office down to the reservation, and how it gets distributed there, I don't know.
Huh. Just interested amongst, if they have their own post offices or something. I'm new to all this Florida stuff.
Their own post office, I don't know, but it's
Right.
never heard of it.
Okay. Does anybody have any other questions? Okay, well, I'd really like to thank you guys for coming tonight. It's been very eye-opening. We've seen a lot of, heard about a lot of different things that I haven't heard about before. I did put a couple posts on the chat if you want to click on the little bubble that says chat there, and I will stay in touch with everybody. Hopefully you've gotten an email from me. If you haven't, I put my email address there and a couple websites where hopefully we'll be able to post a recording of this. And also what I was talking about, the Niles, Florida, that's that 5 books where they just gleaned the information out of the Niles Weekly Register just about Florida. So it's really an awesome resource for research. So, and if you have any questions,
Dean Briggs, say hi to Cantor.
Yes, I will.
And if you're
I'm working right now on a Fort Meade article for our journal,
Okay.
and Cantor's a very good historian,
oh yeah,
especially on Fort Meade.
Okay.
definitely.
That's good.
Do you live in that area?
Pardon?
Do you live in that area?
I'm in Winter Haven,
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Well,
Polk County. Yeah, I had some original letters from Jacob Sutherland during the Civil War, when he was in charge of the cavalry,
mhm.
buying the sutlers with beef. He was a cattleman in Bartow area. So anyway,
Okay.
I appreciated what you did. I think Steve, thank you for Kennedy. He's done a great job of putting this together. What a wonderful! I hope we can do something more like this in the future. Good job. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
thanks everyone. Well, thanks for coming, and hope to see you again soon. October 7th, the Mid-Atlantic Federation is having, we're having a Pennsylvania related presentation. If anybody's interested, I will send that out into an email, but I'll let everybody know what's going on. Should be a pretty good one too. So it's Civil War medicine in Pennsylvania. So pretty neat during the Civil War. Thank you all very much, and I hope to see you soon.
Great
Have a
job.
good
Thank
night.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Good job,
Hey.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night.